Hi, I'm Heather from GG Stitching, and today we are going to take the rows that we completed from the last video and sew them together to make the quilt center. So let's get piecing. Okay, I have my blocks up on the design wall, and we are going to, our rows, we're going to start sewing our rows together. So we're going to actually take down row 1 and row 2 because we're going to start sewing those together. So what we're going to have to do then is we're going to have to make sure that we line those up correctly with each other. We're going to be sewing them right sides together because that's what we've been doing, is right sides together. And because we pressed in the direction of the color, the seams are going opposite directions, which is nice because it means that one's going one way, one's going the other way, and that means they're not going to be quite as bulky. And that also means that when we go to line them up, they should nestle. So when I say nestle, let's see if we can get that in there. When I say nestle, that means that they're going to butt up with each other and they're going to hug in there. They should not overlap at all. It should sit right next to each other in that seam. Let's see if I can get closer to the camera for that. There we go. So they should butt right up against each other. Those little humps should not go over. And you'll actually, when you do this motion with your fingers, you should actually be able to feel them kind of lock into place. I am old school, so that means that when I learned to do this, I used pins to hold things in place. You can use pins, you can use the clips, you can use whatever you want. A lot of people don't like to pin at all. That's your choice. If your seams are not meeting up, and when we open it up, you'll see what I mean. If they're not meeting up the way that you like, it's most likely because something slipped as it was sewing and you hadn't secured it in place. So that's the risk that you take. A lot of people don't like to. It's time consuming. But for your finished product, if you want to make sure that those seams aren't slipping, you're going to either pin or clip to make sure. When you pin, you do not pin directly in the seam. So not in that stitching. What I like to do is on either side of it. So I'm going to show you here. So the stitching is running in between. I do it on either side of it. Holds both of them in place. They're not going to slip anywhere. You do not sew over your pins. You don't want to take a chance of hitting, sewing a needle hitting that. Breaks the needle, could break the pin, could fly off and hit you. Now I have glasses, so it's not that, that scary, but could fly off and hit you. Could drive that broken needle into the bobbin case of your machine, and then you could end up with a burr on your bobbin case and you can ruin your machine. So don't sew over the pins. As you go down the line here, you can do it over each seam, and that's what I'm going to do. I know, like I said, a lot of people don't like to do this part. I do. In the long run, to me, it's worth it to not have to rip it out because I don't like where my seams ended up. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this. We're going to get ready to sew, and I'll show you how to do that, and we'll get right back. Okay, so I have everything, all the seams. Like I said, you can either use straight pins or you can use the clips, whichever ones work nicely for you. So I have those ready. And now we're going to get ready to sew the row. I have my leader here already, so we're going to just start stitching. I do not back stitch at this point. So my rule of thumb is anything that is going to have a seam sewn over it doesn't need a back stitch. Because we're going to be putting borders on here and there will be a seam finishing that off or locking those stitches down, I don't use a back stitch. Now, if I was on the outside row and, like the border row, then I would use a lock stitch or a back stitch because I'm done with it. That's on the outside. There's nothing else that's going to be covering that stitching line. And I'm not necessarily sure how long it will take me to put it on the long arm or to quilt it myself. So I will back stitch then. So for right now, though, I do not need a back stitch to do this. So we're doing a 1/4 inch seam. I'm coming up on that first pin as close as I get as close to it as I can, and then remove it, take another couple stitches to get me near the next one, remove it, and then continue on. Now, as you get ready to come to the next seam, if you feel underneath that it's flipped up, just make sure that you everything is not flipped back there so that everything lies flat. That's just going to help it press better and lay better when you're all done. And I don't try to remove them as I'm going full speed. I usually try to stop right before. Anytime that you take your hands off of it and do some different motion, that's when you could twist or turn and get off course. So you want to make sure that you stop before pulling out the pin. The other thing is, you can see my needle is stopping in the down position. That's help locking it in place. If your machine does not do that, just make sure that you pay attention that nothing is scooching out from underneath the foot. Like I said, I know this can be time consuming, but in the end, it's worth it. Some shortcuts are good, and if it makes it go faster, great. Other shortcuts don't really end up being shortcuts if you have to seam rip and take things out. Okay, we got to the end of the row. Cutting off my leader so that I can add it here. All right. So I have this row together. Now let's look. So see how we meet up nice there? Let's see if we met up. We did really well there too. So we're going to go and press this. Now for the rows pressing, this part is personal preference. You can do the same thing that you only press in one direction. In this case, it won't matter if it's to all the colors because it's going to get to the white and the green and the whatever, whatever. You can press to one side if you like to. For this one, because it's basic and there's not a whole lot of bulk in the seams, pressing to one side is pretty quick and easy. If you prefer, this is where you could press the seams open. To me, for this simple block structure, that's a lot of work. That slows me down. I can press to one side much faster. But if you want to press your seams open, you can at this point. Otherwise, you're going to press to one direction. So I'm going to go and press. Okay, so as I press this row, I'm going to do the same thing that I talked about when pressing the blocks. In other words, my seam, I'm pressing towards this row up here. So I'm finger pressing that open first, making sure that everything is laying nicely. And then I'm going to press. Once again, you do not iron at this stage. You just press the seam. This is where if you do that iron back and forth, you can distort your fabric now. Now, we're not dealing with triangles. Anything with bias would definitely be a no-no for ironing. But it's better to get used to it and do it this way from the start so that you build good habits in your quilting. Okay, so it's all pressed. I have row 1 and 2 on. So we are going to grab row 3 from the design wall. Here's row 3. You can see that the continuation is going, so that looks good. We're going to do right sides together, and we're going to, once again, pin this.
Okay, so here we're going to continue on like we did from row 1 to row 2. And so I'm going to pin the blocks together on either seam so that they nestle, on either side of the seam. And we're just going to continue to sew the rows in that same manner. After each row, it is up to you if you would like to press or not, or if you wait and do it all at once. I personally like to do it after each row. This allows me to get up, stretch, walk around, but then it also lets me make sure that all of my seams are matching and I can check to see if I need to fix anything.
we're going to continue on row to row to row, making sure that we have the colors lined up right, and we're going to keep sewing. Now, as you do this, when you start putting these rows together and you're pinning, this is when you're going to be able to tell if you're having any issues. So 3 things could cause you issues here. This should be laying nice and flat. The seams should line up nice and neat. If you have any excess fabric or a bubble in between and they're not lying right, you're going to need to ask yourself some questions and double check. So 3 things could be happening. 1, 2, or 3. Maybe you need to double check your cutting. Maybe the cutting is wrong. So that would make a difference. And then when you go to put them together, the seams aren't going to line up right. Your 1/4 inch seam may not be correct. So you're going to want to double check your seams. And then finally, you're pressing. You might have pressed and you have a little fold in there. The seam's not flat. If you press from the back and not the front first, you might end up with more folds in there and the seam not pressed nice and flat. So you want to check those things. If you have miscut blocks, okay, you're going to have to go back and recut. If you're seaming wrong, you're going to want to double check your seam and maybe, use marking tape or something there to get the correct seam. Some of that, if it's not too bad, you can distribute it by adding pins throughout, evening it out a little bit. And then when you feed it through, those feed dogs will help even feed it through. Now, you might be able to do that with like an extra little 1/4 of an inch or something. But if you have, a 1/2 an inch or even, too much, it's not going to feed in there right. You're going to end up with puckers. And so you really want to watch that. That first row, when you do it, you're going to see if you had any issues. So you're going to want to double check that. Double check if the cut size is right. If it's not, you're going to have to go back and recut. If it's your seaming, make adjustments to see if that you can make the seaming, better, so that your measurements come out properly. Check your pressing.
Okay, all 10 rows are sewn together. After you get them sewn together, lay it out. Make sure that the pattern is going the way that it should go, that no blocks are out of place, because now is the time to fix it before you get the borders on. So here we go, 8 by 10. These are the baby quilt size, the 4.5. Even if you did the lap size with the 6.5 inch squares, the layout is the same and it should look like this.
Okay, we've gotten our rows together and we have the center of our quilt top completed. In the next video, we will work on borders and get one step closer to having your first quilt project completed. If you found this information helpful, please comment, like, subscribe. Let me know that the content that I'm creating for you is useful, helpful, and you are close to getting your first project done. Until next time, happy quilting.